On June the 18th, 1812, U.S. President James Madison signed the Declaration of War that would begin the War of 1812. British, Canadian, and Indian troops would repel the American invaders into British North America, but the three-year-long conflict would largely end in a draw. Still, it was a key moment in the building of the nation that would become Canada. And this year, the federal government has organized a series of events marking that 200th anniversary. One of those events, a fascinating new exhibit at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. It opened today, and if you're coming to Ottawa this summer, put it on your calendar. I spoke to Heritage Minister James Moore about it earlier today at the museum. Well, Minister Moore, thank you so much for joining us. And it must be a fun time to be the Heritage Minister because you're getting to celebrate a unique event, the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. Let me ask in general terms what some of the government's objectives are for all Canadians to participate in this particular celebration.
Around every Canada Day of every year, the Historic Dominion Institute and others put out polls that show how weak Canadians' often understanding is of our history. And we want to do better than that. We want Canadians to be more, as in a sense, engaged with our history. And so this exhibit, which is going to travel around the country, is about engaging Canadians in our history. In only 3 of Canada's 13 provinces and territories is it mandatory for a high school student to take a history course before they graduate from high school. And we see the results of that. We see less engagement of people understanding our history from one region to the other, and we want to improve that. July 1st of this year marks the 5-year countdown to our 150th birthday, and we want to take opportunities like the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812 to talk about our history and why it matters to us.
Now, of course, this was a conflict that involved Canadians, Aboriginal people, British soldiers, fighting our now best friends, the Americans. Was there ever some concerns, or I'm not sure if it was really something you got involved with, that we didn't want to see triumphalist Canadians? How do you approach getting the tone right? Because at the time, of course, Canadians very much beat themselves around the chest by saying they fought off the Americans.
Well, there's a little bit of sensitivity, but it's not as thick as people might think it is. I mean, there's 200 years of calming of things since then. But certainly there's a little bit of sensitivity towards it. But that is actually one of the stories to be told about the War of 1812, is that as a consequence of this war, we've had the longest lasting and most prosperous friendship in the history of humanity. We have the most successful trading relationship, and we've had peace between our countries for now just over 200 years. And this is, I think, one of the things to be learned about the War of 1812. So there's a little bit of sensitivity. I mean, you don't gloat about the burning of the White House. We also don't gloat about winning and losing certain battles. You don't gloat about the fact that Isaac Brock was killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights. There's no gloating about this. This is about education, understanding what the war was, what it led to, and the lessons to be learned. Now,
one of the issues I'm certain you've heard is that if people have heard about the War of 1812, they may think it's just a Southern Ontario event. It's just something for the Niagara Peninsula. But of course, events happened outside that. Yeah. But you, as a British Columbian, when you talk to folks in your riding, what do you tell them about why British Columbians ought to be interested in this particular conflict?
Without the War of 1812, Canada's territorial definition is not defined as separate of that for the United States. Don't forget, the Americans had Manifest Destiny, right, which reached all the way to the North Pole. So the War of 1812 was very much about defining the creation of Canada in 1867. Without the War of 1812, the French fact is not protected in Canada. As a matter of fact, the French communities, certainly in Quebec, would have had a much more different future than what was the case after the War of 1812. Aboriginal Canadians had a much different future in Canada after the War of 1812 than American Indians did after the War of 1812. So this was an event whose footprint may have been physically small, but whose consequence was pan-Canadian in nature, and that's why this exhibit isn't one that's just going to sit here in Ottawa. It's going to travel the country. There's an online component as well, because we want all Canadians, because in southwest Ontario there's actually a pretty deep and rich understanding of the war and what it meant, and people go to Fort George and they go to Fort York and Fort Erie and they understand Isaac Brock and then Tecumseh and these names and their legend. But when you get the further beyond southwest Ontario you get, there's a greater gap in understanding, and that's part of what this effort that we're doing as a government is all about, is to try to close that gap so people have a better understanding of our history and why the War of 1812 matters beyond just southwest Ontario.
One of the things I've noticed as well, and I speak of this as someone who has a history degree, it's been, mind you, 20 years since, is that the text at the time perhaps didn't focus as much on the role of Aboriginal Canadians as it seems to be now. I don't know if your officials have had discussions with museum officials that they're very much an equal partner along with the British troops and the habitants and the Canadians of the time.
Tecumseh didn't know it then, but he really is a Canadian hero. What he managed to do in terms of rallying North American First Nation support onto the British side in repelling the American invasion, in the hopes ultimately, of course, of a confederation, of an Aboriginal confederation, was something that was absolutely critical to the success of what were to become Canadians, or the British at the time, in the War of 1812. So his personal leadership in this in this war and the role of Aboriginals is a critical part of the understanding of the story of the War of 1812, and also the tragedy for them and the outcome of the war, because for many Aboriginal Canadians, that the outcome of the War of 1812 and the aspiration that they had and why they got involved was not realized. And so it's a very different perspective, which is why the exhibit here has the 4 different perspectives, because it's always, you can look at history just through a linear lens and just try to take points in time and chain them together. But when you look at history in a more dynamic way from different perspectives, it's a much more rich story, the War of 1812, not just of invasion and repelling an invasion, but of the tragedies and triumphs that were within it.
Minister James Moore, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.